Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. A couple of weeks ago, a little while ago, I did a video talking about Breitling and the direction they were going, speculating, etc. And a comment came back that said one of the things that what they wanted to see was a newer, more modern take on bezels. And in particular, they wanted to see Breitling dump those rider tabs, very 90s kind of ideas, and move into something more contemporary. That, first off, I don't want to see that happen, but secondly, it made me start thinking about brand signature moves, the things that they incorporate into their watches that just say them, when a lot of us don't like those signatures. And I just started to list some of them in my head, and I thought that would make a decent video. So here are 5 brands that have got divisive signature moves, things that when you see them you know it's that brand, and so from that point of view it is good, but a lot of us hate those moves, and I give my quick opinion on each of them as well. So see you on the other side of the intro. You'll get to see my thoughts, and we'll have a chat about it at the end. Okay, so let's get into this. I'm going to start with a discussion of the feature which really inspired this conversation for me, which are the Breitling rider tabs. For those of you who don't know, these are small tabs at the cardinal points of the bezel, which act as obvious visual references for those cardinal points, and also as grips for turning the bezel and making it really easy to use that bezel in all conditions, wet, dry, in gloves, barehanded, whatever you need. In some watches, these tabs are removable and interchangeable. Why would you want to do that? So that you can convert your bezel into a count up or count down bezel, however it suits you. It is absolutely fair to say these things are not universally liked. Some people see them as a bit fussy, a bit overly complex. They break up the profile of the watch. And I think one of the key criticisms people make here is that they're dated. They're a very 80s, 90s kind of feel. And I can see all of those criticisms. I can see where they come from. Personally, though, I've got to say I'm a fan of rider tabs in general, and also some of the things that people rail against, I actually embrace as a positive boon. So for example, I think they add a bit of visual interest. For me, this kind of, quite often the bezel serves as a bridge between the dial and the case, and a boring bezel routinely says that when you transition from the dial, the case will be equally boring. I like having a little bit more interest, a bit more excitement in that bezel, which generally will flow into a more exciting, interesting and engaging watch overall. I have found them very useful. They do make using the bezel super easy. I also like that they give the watch designer the option of going with an otherwise smooth bezel with no grips, no knurling, no scalloping, no frills, but you can still use it effectively, which is really cool. Finally, I personally like timeliness in a watch. This whole timeless form follows function mantra tends to leave me cold. It removes all context from the watch and contributes to a homogenization of design and aesthetic. For me, elements that take a watch and then ground it in a time and a place, that give it a story and a reason, are brilliant, and I love them. And that's one of the reasons why I really do love rider tabs. Okay, so from Breitling to Omega, now we're going to talk about the HEV, the helium escape valve, more specifically the manual helium escape valve that Omega feels it needs to use on its Seamaster divers. Look, the truth is, for across the board, helium escape valves are generally silly. They are needed for a very, very specific purpose for those people who go saturation diving, for when they are in these weird environments in the dry after a dive at extreme depths. Still, on the other hand, for most of us, dive watches are frankly silly. So I suppose there's an argument to be said. Once you've decided to be silly and go for a dive watch, why not be completely and authentically silly and include the bizarre features like a HEV? So I kind of do embrace that silliness myself. If I go for a dive, you know what? Give me 1,000 meters water resistance and you better have a HEV. I don't know why, but I just feel like it should be there. It completes the story. However, the truth is these helium escape valves can be small, can be discreet, can be hidden, and can be totally automatic. So why does Omega give us this? Why do they give us something that's big, bulky, obvious, and manual? Especially when in all the research I've been able to do on this, it seems to me that saturation divers across the board seem to say that the Omega system is the silliest implementation of this kind of complication, that it's really reliant on the diver remembering to use it, that it's the most error prone and failure prone way of doing these things. But so why does Omega do it? You know what? They do it because it's a signature. It's what they do. It's how they roll. It's, for whatever reason, it's how they did it back when they were introduced with it. It's become associated with them and it's stuck. And they're not popular. The Omega HEV is routinely derided as a wart. A lot of people comment that they love the SMP, but they can't get into it because of the wart. But what we'd say is, given the numbers of SMPs that do get sold, this commitment to time and place, this little reminder of history, isn't stopping people buying them in enough numbers for Omega to keep going. Maybe this is the exact example of where a signature, even though it's a bit silly, even though some people don't like it, works. And the little wart actually earns its place. Personally, I'm on the fence about the HEV, the manual HEV that Omega uses. Aesthetically, I don't love it, but lots of watches have multi-crowns. It's out of the way. It's not dial side. It's not in your face. And that little nod to the past does have some charm. So I can kind of live with it. Moving from Omega to its most likely and most commonly understood competitor, Rolex, and I'm going to go here with the Cyclops. The truth is that Rolex has a number of signatures, some of which have got nothing to do with the watches, but rather their behavior. Unwavering discipline, careful response to the market, unparalleled focus to brand and branding are all signature moves of Rolex. But I think if you go down to the watches, the signature that marks out a Rolex is that Cyclops. Now, and they're not the only brand to use it. Seiko does it a lot too. But I think even then, Seiko only does it here and there. For Rolex, it is very much a signature move. It's very much their thing. Now, why is it there at all? Actually, it's pretty obvious. It's a date magnifier, and it does exactly what it says on the tin. And from my experience handling a lot of Rolexes, I'll put my hand up and say it does this really, really well. From a functionality point of view, the Cyclops absolutely earns its place. And for Rolex and its fans, it achieves something really useful. See, Rolex is a company that's trying to walk a really careful balance. It's trying to be both rooted in its own past as a brand, but also disconnected from the past more generally. And the Cyclops is like one of those balance beams carried by a tightrope walker. It's a visual reference which allows Rolex to do that. It allows Rolex to keep a link through all of its watches going back to the 50s, whilst at the same time allowing Rolex to kind of ignore the history around the watch altogether. Now, it's useful and it does lots of good things, but you can't talk about the Rolex Cyclops without saying that it is at best divisive. Why is it divisive? because for those of us who don't like it, it's ugly. It is ugly in a way that cannot be avoided. Every time you so much as glance at this watch, there it is, glaring back at you like a malignant tumor. It gets dirty. It can feel like a bit of a kludge, a bit like duct tape and offcuts being used to solve a problem. But ultimately, I think for most people that don't like it, it really just comes back to the fact that it's ugly. Now, personally, how do I feel about it? I despise the Cyclops. I can understand its usefulness and I can understand its history, but I cannot get past its monkey butt ugliness. I will not own a watch with a Cyclops. And now, to be absolutely clear, my feelings about this particular feature extends to brands that I actively collect and buy. I am a Seiko Prospex diver collector, and I will not buy one that has a Cyclops. So that's okay in a Seiko world. It gets problematic with Rolex, where it is, as I say, a signature for them. Okay, so moving from Rolex to perhaps its up-and-coming rival, Grand Seiko. I think here the signature move we're seeing a lot is the power reserve indicator. Now, if you're a lover of automatic and manual wind watches and you're serious about accuracy, you need a power reserve indicator. You really want to keep that movement in its sweet spot of power reserve, usually at least 75% powered up, in that top 25. You could argue that if it's spring drive, you're not so affected by this. Yes and no. It is true that a spring drive watch is less affected by the power winding down, that the quartz regulation will keep that under control. But then on the other hand, if it winds down to the point that it stops and has to be reset, all of that accuracy is wasted. So either way, with a mechanical watch that you want to keep super accurate and not have to adjust, you really do want to know what the power situation is and keep that power reserve up. And so Seiko delivers them. They make them big, impossible to miss, easy to use, and pretty specific to the way they use to their design. But we routinely don't like them very much. And there's a common reason for that. It's really simple. They aren't particularly attractive. What is tricky here is, unlike the Cyclops, they're not normally ugly. They're not hideous, disgusting things. They're normally well done, well finished, tucked away on the dial. So why don't we like them? I think for Grand Seiko especially, it's about context. Grand Seiko dials are things of beauty. At their price point, I would say they are things of unparalleled beauty. No one in their region makes dials that look anywhere near as good as a Grand Seiko dial. And the power reserve ruins that beauty. It might be a function over form thing to say, you know what, we're going to create this beautiful dial, but have to live with the power reserve because that function is essential. And it might be some sort of wabi-sabi thing for Grand Seiko, who think that true beauty requires some imperfection to remind us that of the impermanence and the impossibility of a perfectly beautiful product. Either way, Grand Seiko is not giving up on its power reserves, and it does seem to have become a signature of the brand. Okay, so what's my personal take on the Grand Seiko Power Reserve signature move? I don't like it. I suppose, like the Helium escape valve that Omega use, it's not inherently ugly as a Cyclops is for Rolex. So it certainly doesn't invoke the visceral response that a Cyclops does for me. However, like a Cyclops, the power reserve indicator is unavoidable. It's dial side, always there, always lurking, despoiling the otherwise beautiful background of some of those Grand Seiko dials. And I just can't do it. That desecration, if you like, of a otherwise beautiful dial is just too much for me. Okay, so my final signature move here is from Tudor, and of course it's going to be the snowflake hands. These hands are really useful. They give the hour hand a real outsized presence and allows for quick and dirty approximate time on the go at a glance. No need to sit and focus carefully on where the hour hand is. Quick glance, it's just after 2. That's all I need to know. If I do need any more information, I'll go look at the minute hand, which is sitting there doing nothing. That's its job. Its job is to tell me precise times. It's really just another variation of a series of broad arrows, Seiko monsters, Mercedes hands, cathedral hands, all intended to achieve that same outsized effect to allow quick and dirty approximate times on the go. But of all of those options I've given, the snowflake, or being less poetic but possibly more accurate, the block hand, is probably the crudest. And it's there that the vision arises. Yes, the snowflake hand is effective at giving you that quick time at a glance, but it's about as subtle as a punch to the face and as elegant as a giraffe in ice skates. It's a Minecraft hand in a world of 4K high-def television games. For me, personally, it's okay. I don't love it, but I could live with it. It's survivable as a watch for me, unlike, say, the power reserve indicator for Grand Seiko, because unlike a Grand Seiko dial, a Tudor dial isn't really trying to achieve much. It's not really wanting to be much more than just useful. Tudor dials, in fact, Tudor watches overall are pretty plain, quite utilitarian. They bring that retro styling with them. And so this anachronistic little blip, even though it's dial side and in constant view, kind of I can accommodate it in a way I can't for, say, the Cyclops or the snowflake. It's not so much that the snowflake hand is somehow better looking than the power reserve or the Cyclops. It's just that in that context, I can kind of roll with it. Okay, so that's it. 5 signature moves from 5 different brands. 1 or 2 I kind of like, 1 or 2 I kind of hate, 1 or 2 kind of in the middle. What do you think? Which are the ones that you can't live with? Which are the ones that you actually quite like, despite the fact being quite divisive? Are there some other brands that have got other distinctly signature ideas? And I don't mean here just broad brush, this is kind of how we do business type things. I did think about like Meistersinger and one-handers, but that's more of a style than a signature, maybe. Although maybe Meistersinger makes it with its one-handers. What are some others? Anyway, let me know in the comments below, and maybe I'll do a follow-up with other signature moves that suck. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches, and I'll see you later. Bye.